Hello? Thank you for coming back to read with me Planting Churches That Reproduce by Joel Comiskey. This reading is specifically for our church as we're getting ready for our church retreat. That's why I'm jumping ahead to the end of the book, to the title of the chapter, which is Planting House Churches, chapter 9. If you are not a part of our church and are not coming to our retreat and you want to read the book in order, I'll get back and I'll read it, but I'm jumping ahead specifically for our church because this is what's relevant for us as we're going to our church retreat in a couple of weeks. Okay, so chapter 9, Planting House Churches. We've lived in Moreno Valley long enough to see myriads of houses constructed. As I've passed by the new tracts of homes, I've often dreamed of the day when those homes would be used for a dual purpose, for normal living and to reach a lost world for Jesus Christ. Traditionally, people leave their home to go to church and then go back to their homes to live. I long for the day when the church is in the home, and planting of new churches primarily involves the use of existing homes. The early church movement flowed along those lines. Is it possible to simply meet in homes or other facilities that can accommodate a very small number of people? This is exactly what the house church strategy proposes. And there are plenty of examples of house-based churches in the New Testament. The church in the house of Mary, Acts 12:12. Church in the house of Priscilla and Aquila, Romans 16:3-5 and 1 Corinthians 16:19. The church in the house of Nympha, Colossians 4:15. The church in the house of Archippus, Philemon verse 2. There are also examples of Jesus and the early Christians going to people's houses where they would heal people, evangelize people, and baptize entire households and disciple new believers. David Garrison says that house churches are standalone churches that happen to be small enough to meet in homes. After filling their limited space, they grow through multiplication, rather than increasing their membership. Each house church has its own leadership and derives its authority directly from Christ, rather than through a church hierarchy. It functions in every way as a church. God has time and time again used the house church as a model to draw the church back to a more New Testament and simple form of church life and mission. Not only in persecuted countries. I have said repeatedly that the best application for house churches is in persecuted, resistant contexts because persecution forced the early church to meet in homes. Not because this was the preferred setting for the church. Yet the authors of home cell groups and house churches make a valid point. They say, it is a mistaken notion to conclude that the only reason the apostolic community developed house churches was because a persecuted minority and therefore could not go public in its institutional expression. As a matter of fact, the early church was quite public in its witness, despite the fact that it was persecuted. I still believe that the most rapid growth in the house church movement is in restricted access areas like China, Asia, and North Africa. I attended one mission gathering and heard a missionary representative for China talk about house churches springing up like wildfire. The representative spoke of one Chinese leader who had planted 30,000 churches, all house churches. This Chinese leader trains people, and within 3 weeks they are expected to plant a church. This type of church planting doesn't take place in many contexts. There is no doubt, however, that house church ministry has become increasingly popular and accepted. Larry Kreider, co-author of Starting a House Church, writes, within the next 10 to 15 years, I believe these new house church networks will dot the landscape of North America just as they already do in other nations of the world. Places like China, Central Asia, Latin America, India, and Cambodia have experienced tremendous growth through house churches and disciple and empower each member to be the church. Characteristics of house churches. My brother Andy has a unique personality. For starters, he has a dramatic humor that causes people to double over laughing. I don't know where he got it. In fact, people often tell me, "You're kidding, Andy's your brother?" Yet Andy and I have far more in common than not. We have similar mannerisms, passions, and outlook on life. Why? DNA. Tom and Phyllis Comiskey gave birth to us and raised us under the same roof. The house church movement has the same DNA, yet it's diverse. Some authors emphasize principles that others do not. Yet common features of house churches surpass their differences. One thing is certain: house church planting offers a very simple and reproducible expression of Christ's church. Simple structure. Ed Stetzer states, "My attraction to the house church springs from its simplicity and faith. I have been a part of large church starts. Each involved more and more money. In my heart, I often feel that church planting should be simpler. The idea behind home churches is not to grow one church larger, but to keep the church intimate while reproducing other intimate fellowships in other locales. Many New Testament church practices cannot function effectively in large impersonal groups. Home churches form communities of believers who get to know each other in all aspects of life. They share their spiritual gifts to edify the body. Authentic Christianity has a greater chance of emerging in the lives of individuals and families because intimacy and accountability are built into the church. The goal of each house church is to reproduce other new churches." Bob Fitz Sr. says, "Our goal is not just to start a church. Our goal is to start a church planting movement. We believe this can best be done by focusing on the simplest and most reproducible form of church planting. The house church meets that need." One reason why house churches are reproducible is because they lack a hierarchical structure. The house church movement focuses on simple, reproducible strategies that release common Christians for uncommon work. They celebrate evangelism and reproduction that is natural and spontaneous. This reproduction is occurring at every level and in every unit of the church life. As people are released into ministry, new interdependent churches are formed. Pastor Nancy T. Ammerman, sociologist of religion at Hartford Seminary, writes, "This development of house churches shows people looking for faith's essence." Or this development, meaning house churches, shows people looking for faith's essence. They are no longer willing to finance huge buildings, a large staff, insurance policies, advertising campaigns, and the leaking church roof because it all simply seems irrelevant. One misconception of the house church movement is that all house churches meet in homes. Larry Kreider, a proponent of house churches, started using the phrase micro-church to highlight the fact that not all house churches meet in a house. Some will meet in coffee shops, galleries, and other places. Others prefer the term simple church or organic church. Neil Cole, house church planter and author of Organic Church, plants organic churches in restaurants, bars, or other places besides just homes. No clergy or professionals are necessary. House churches do not require ordained seminary-trained professionals to function properly. House churches point to the fact that New Testament teaching does not recognize clergy and laity distinctions. Those who are seminary or Bible school trained can be assets to house churches, sometimes serving as catalysts who plant the first few house churches in a given area or people group. But they don't always have to be physically present for house churches to have legitimacy or theological understanding. House churches do need godly, mature leadership, as it says in 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, and 1 Peter 5. The training, however, happens primarily through an informal approach, with basic Bible knowledge and practical ministry as the main components. Most house church leaders are volunteers. Financial resources are normally used to support itinerant workers, missions, or meeting the practical needs of members such as the poor, widows, and orphans. In most cases, the house church does collect an offering, and in rare cases, a house church may decide to support one of the leaders. Bob Fitz Sr. writes, "A house church will be able to channel almost all of its finances into ministry. There may be some minor expenses, but since the meeting will be held in houses, all building expenses will be avoided. In this way, only 10 tithing families could support a full-time pastor. Since one pastor could oversee more than one house church, he does not have to receive all of his support from one congregation." No special buildings. House churches meet in ordinary homes or other places that are free from rent or payments. Maintenance and overhead related to a church building are eliminated. Larry Kreider writes, The Chinese house church movement has made a commitment to the Lord concerning how the church will exist, even when they are freed from communism in the future. They have already made a decision that they will build no buildings. They want to keep their method of training and sending intact and not focus on constructing buildings, but on building people. The house church movement, more than any other strategy, is building proof. Money is not spent on buildings and on maintenance. Fully the church. House churches are fully functioning churches in themselves. They partake of the Lord's Supper, baptize, marry, bury, and exercise church discipline. Many house churches, however, do network with other house churches for mutual accountability, encouragement, and cooperation. House churches are normally led by volunteers and meet for participatory meetings which involve prayer, worship, the word, and outreach. Food and fellowship are also important elements. They have a simple order of meeting. There is no set order for house church meetings. One well-known house church leader suggests using the 5 W's: welcome, worship, word, works, and witness, as one possibility. Yet, most house churches have an open, participatory style with no single order in mind. Even when there is a more directive teaching given by the leader or one of the members, there is always plenty of time for group discussion and response to the message. The goal is to have all those present to practice their spiritual gifts. Most would agree that although certain elements may be pre-planned, there is freedom to follow the Holy Spirit if He changes those plans. It's common in the house church to celebrate the Lord's Supper as a full meal. This often takes place at the start or the end of the house church meeting, but may take place on an entirely different day. House churches point back to Acts 2:46, where believers broke bread from house to house. Celebrating the Lord's Supper as a meal can be seen in 1 Corinthians 11:20-26, where Paul talked about participating in an actual meal. Different sizes. In the past, I described a house church as a community of 20 to 40 people who met together on a weekly basis, but were more or less independent of other house churches. More recently, there has been a new emphasis in the house church movement. A new version of the house church movement promotes smaller-sized house churches. Wolfgang Simpson, for example, teaches that many house churches today have between 8 to 15 members and typically multiply every 6 to 9 months. Rad Zadero wrote a book called The Global House Church Movement. He himself planted a house church network in Canada, and he writes, "House churches should not grow too large before they decide to multiply. Otherwise, the loss of intimacy, openness, and interaction will eventually compromise the group's attractiveness and plateau the numbers." Currently, around the globe, explosive Christian conversion growth from church planting movement is characterized by the reproduction of multiplying house churches and cell groups of no more than 10 to 30 people. Starting house churches. I met a house church planting missionary in Indonesia who told me that planting house churches was extremely simple. The main thing is to meet friends and neighbors. Then you need to gather them in your house to hear God's word. As you make disciples of those attending, they will be prepared to start their own house churches. Planting a house church, or movement of house churches, is all about loving people into the kingdom. The beauty is the simplicity. It's about reaching out to non-believers, gathering them in, and continuing the process with another house church. The neighbors hear the singing and worship and will ask about what's happening. An organic church doesn't depend on a building. It depends on people. The house church planter seeks to find people who are divinely appointed by God to hear the message and receive the gospel. He or she gathers the persons of peace into the small group. The goal is to meet the person's need and eventually develop him or her to be the next house church planter. Rad Zadero has adopted the motto, "Every church, start a church every year." He believes that a new house church can be planted every 6 to 18 months, which seems to be the case for church planting movements in places like China and India. In my personal communications with Zadero, he cautions that this suggested timeline should not be applied mechanically. Rather, the Holy Spirit must lead and open the doors for new leaders to emerge, and for new house churches to start in His own time and manner. Only so many people can meet in one house. When the house church becomes too large to meet in the average-sized living room, Another group is sent to begin a house church in another place. Whoever is called to lead the next group should be a reproducing believer who can evangelize lost people, disciple those who come to Jesus, and lead the core team in planting the next house church. Dick Scoggins, in his book, Planting House Churches in Networks, recommends that each house church planter writes out a clear vision of how and when to plant a new house church. From his experience in planting house churches, he warns against the danger of koinonitis, or inward fellowship that turns into navel-gazing. Each house church planter needs to have a clear vision to reproduce. Larry Kreider and Floyd McClung give 5 simple steps to starting house churches. 1. Pray. 2. Meet people. 3. Make disciples. 4. Gather. 5. Multiply. It's that simple. It does not require a PhD or years of Bible school. One key difference between a house church and a cell church is leadership. In many house churches, the house church pastor doesn't have a higher authority, but rather works cooperatively as a peer with other house church pastors. In contrast, those planting a cell in the cell church strategy are accountable to the leadership of the local church they are part of. Many have criticized the independence of the house church movement, myself included. It's been refreshing to hear from many house church authors making the same criticism. Many house church proponents today promote the need for house churches to network with other house churches. Some proponents suggest gathering house churches on a monthly or quarterly basis for celebrative worship and retreats. House church networking may also include going on mission trips with other larger churches. The suggestion is also made by a growing number of advocates that equipping ministries of the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers is not only biblical, but is also essential to help launch house church networks and movements that can impact entire cities with the gospel. Networks can function in different ways. They may be highly informal, connected only by an occasional joint gathering or special times to share ideas with one another. Or they may be formally networked together as sister churches that function with common goals and projects. Some, like Wolfgang Simpson, advocate a city church idea. According to this idea, individual house churches, although full-fledged churches in themselves, also seek out broader fellowship with other house churches and or traditional churches in a city. A particular house church might collaborate with First Christian Church or Central Assembly of God to engage in cross-congregational ministry. Some in the house church movement believe that the city-wide church concept is one of the most important expressions of the local church. They base this on the fact that the New Testament writers refer to a single church of this city or of that city. Bill Beckham has analyzed this view in detail. No matter how churches network, a growing consensus insists that house churches must avoid an exclusive and ingrown mentality. Radzadero writes, "It is absolutely crucial that house churches form networks that pray, plan, and play together. So long as house churches choose isolation, independence, and inwardness, so long will they remain a mere novelty, a trend, a fad, without ever becoming a real movement that deeply impacts their city, region, or nation with the gospel. They must unite." Cell churches and house church networks are cousins. House church networks and cell churches have much more in common than not. Both find their basis for ministry in the New Testament, not just in a general way, but in a specific one. Both see clear references to cell celebration and house churches. Both long for simplicity, less programs and professionalism, and more emphasis on developing disciples who make disciples. I believe, in fact, that Jesus is calling his church back to a New Testament emphasis. House church networks and cell churches are leading the way. Larry Kreider, an advocate of both cell churches and house churches, writes, "Dove Christian Fellowship International, the worldwide network of cell-based churches that I and a team of spiritual leaders oversee, is broadening our territory to include house church networks. We realize that cell-based community churches, cell-based megachurches, and house church networks, although different, are close cousins. Our experience thus far has been mostly with cells in a megachurch and with cells in community churches. I've talked with Larry Kreider on various occasions about the differences between cell churches and house church networks. During a recent conversation, I asked him about the new micro churches that Dove is establishing. He gave an example of one of the Dove house church networks where he actually attends. Each of the house churches in the network meets weekly, but then the network of house churches come together approximately once a month to celebrate. Kreider thinks that the most healthy house churches meet together on a regular basis, normally once per month. But this is exactly what we're doing at Wellspring, the church I planted, I told him. The life groups meet weekly and come together to celebrate once a month. Granted, we are actively looking for a place to hold weekly celebrations. Yet some cell churches will never choose to meet weekly in celebration. So what is the key difference? Larry mentioned that one difference was the way house churches keep the offering. In a house church network that he is coaching, the house churches give a percentage of the money to the network so that both individual house churches and the network determine how the money will be spent. I don't see much difference here, I told him. I've observed cell churches that pool their money in a similar way. The cells and the cell networks divide how the money will be spent. Often the individual cells will use the money on outreach and other projects. Both Larry and I agreed that house church networks are more informal and give more liberty to each house church. Yet, it seems to be a matter of degree. Cell church networks can also be flexible. We also agreed that whether or not someone uses the terminology cell church or house church network, the most important thing is that the Great Commission be fulfilled. I shared with Larry my concerns that the house church leaders were not receiving enough coaching. Kreider admitted that coaching is essential. He felt that house church networks need help to assure that each house church is properly coached. I asked him what he did with children in the house church. He told me that often the children in microchurch will meet with the adults in the beginning, but will then go to another room for their own Bible time. This is exactly what we do in many of our life groups, I told him. My bias: cell church or connected house church? Simple house church planting and cell church planting share much in common. I do believe, however, that a cell church or a house church network should highlight certain characteristics. House church leaders need coaching. I believe that leaders need coaching. Yes, the Holy Spirit is the great coach, but he uses humans to get the job done. Isolated house church leaders or cell leaders are not nearly as effective as those who have a coach. Michael Jordan needed a coach. Why would Michael Jordan need a coach? Because the coach could help Jordan maximize his game, take a rest when needed, defend against overzealous players, and point out the overlooked details of the game. Players look at the immediate task, but the coach is able to provide the bigger picture. Small group leaders left to themselves, whether cell leaders or house church leaders, become less effective. My journey in the cell church world has taught me that coaching is a critical component. In the cell church scheme, or the connected house church paradigm, the coach plays a crucial role. In fact, each leader has a coach to assure fruitfulness, and to help the leader achieve the God-given goals. In the cell church scheme, or the connected house church paradigm, the coach plays an intimate role to assure fruitfulness. Another important reason for coaching is to achieve rapid multiplication. It's more difficult to achieve an independent leader than a networked one who has a coach. I think it would be difficult to raise up an independent pastor of a group of 6 to 12 people. It's far more likely that the person will step up to the plate if he or she knows that coaching will occur on a regular basis. Kreider says, the house church and the cell group provide an ideal opportunity for everyone to experience spiritual family and to eventually become spiritual parents themselves. The purpose for house church multiplication and cell multiplication is to give the opportunity for new parents to take responsibility and to start a new spiritual family. A need for an equipping track. A small group leader should not have to decide what training he or she should receive. Cell churches or house church networks should lay out a training path to maintain quality. In my book, Leadership Explosion, I share principles that cell churches use to train their leaders to multiply groups. A church can greatly increase their effectiveness by providing clear-cut training, rather than hoping that an independent leader will find his or her way. For example, Xenos Christian Fellowship has networked their house churches into an organized structure to assure the quality of training. As mentioned earlier, a house church or cell network does not have to meet weekly. However, they should meet regularly for both teaching and encouragement. In restricted access countries, it's not possible to hold a celebration service. In free countries, however, where this is possible, the church should take advantage of the opportunity to gather for celebration services. A spirit of independence is always dangerous and should be avoided like the plague. Bill Beckham says, "I believe the New Testament design of the church will express itself some way at the local level in both large and small group life. I think that the large group gatherings should be planned to make sure they will actually happen. It seems idealistic to simply hope they will happen. Why not plan for the cells or house churches to come together on a regular basis? The celebration refreshes the leaders, provides impetus for outreach, and glorifies God as people worship in unity. Planting churches that reproduce requires simplicity, but they must not be left alone. Leaders need coaching, training, and refreshment of meeting together to worship God and press on. And the goal is not to plant just one church, but a movement of churches, a church planting movement." David Garrison writes, "It is important to understand the role of small house and cell churches in the life of a church planting movement. It is now easy to see why missionaries who want to start a church planting movement without house or cells will find it difficult. God is using cell churches and house church networks to reproduce church planting movements all over our world." So that's the end of chapter 9. Thank you for reading with me. We'll see you soon.